So this weekend, 2 days after Valentine's, seems the perfect time to talk about love, God's steadfast love that endures forever, or maybe the passionate love described in the Song of Songs. Well, instead, we're going to read this from Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 21. You have heard that it was said of those in ancient times, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment." But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, "You fool," you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. As if that's not harsh enough, let's keep going. You have heard it said that you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go to hell. All right. It was also said, because that wasn't enough, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And again, you have heard that it was said to those in ancient times, "You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord." But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no, and anything more than this comes from the evil one. Oh, jeez. I mean, what a bummer. It just seems like the worst time to have Jesus talking about divorce and adultery and lies and anger. I mean, we're surrounded by hearts and candy and flowers and cards that sum up love in a few rhyming sentences or with a funny picture. But I spent all week with this passage. And Jesus just sounds so harsh and un-Valentine-y. That's a word, right? Okay. Though you know that Saint Valentine, of which there is actually more than one, I found out, was a Christian martyr. Died for following Jesus. So Valentine's Day is not so Valentine-y either. And my natural reaction to this passage is to kind of do what Valentine's Day does to love, which is kind of simplify it. You know, make it pretty easy and palatable, much easier than it actually is in real life. But I think in this passage, pretty much like all the rest of the time when Jesus speaks about love, he speaks about the complexity of it. He speaks about the challenge of it, but also reminds us of the world-changing power of loving and treating other people well. And he reminds us that it really can't be summed up in a few sentences, and it really doesn't fit on the front of a candy heart. So let's just dig in. So when we read this passage, you have to pay attention to a particular phrase. Anytime something gets repeated several times, that's always a good marker. And Jesus keeps saying, "You have heard it said," and inserts the law, and then he says, "But I say to you." He's upping the ante right there. He's saying, you know the old law, but Jesus is about to lay down the intention of the law. And he spends a great deal of time arguing about the law throughout the Gospels, which was a pretty common practice in Jewish circles and really valuable. It got people to dig into the scriptures in a particularly in-depth way, and I can never argue with that. But the difference is Jesus has a slightly different level of authority in this teaching. So when he says, I say unto you, he's saying it as the Son of God and the Messiah. So pay attention. And the first teaching comes from the Ten Commandments. And he mentions the law is, we know not to murder. Okay, that's not usually a big issue for this crowd. But then Jesus says, being angry with a brother or sister or insulting them is just as dangerous, leading to serious judgment from God. Jesus says calling another a fool is enough to land you in the hot water with God. Now, on one level, this sounds ridiculous. And he's being hyperbolic in order to make a point, which was also common practice in Jewish teachings, but it was to make a point. It's to make the point that our words really do have that much power, which anybody who has ever been bullied knows. By this point, there's nobody here who hasn't read or seen some of the deep damage that has happened to our children from elementary all the way through high school and college by name-calling bullying. And we as adults deep down know that it doesn't really stop there, that we can do it in more subtle ways. We even read, unfortunately, all the time about people who are gay or homosexual who choose to end their lives rather than live with the teasing and the discrimination and the abuse. As a larger population, we often devour all the sordid details of the next celebrity or politician's scandal and downfall. And this one was hard for me to write, but it still felt true. We don't want to admit deep down that on some level, there's a tiny piece of us that enjoys being able to point our finger and call the other fool. Jesus also talks about how anger aids us in withholding, forgiveness, and reconciliation. And I couldn't help but think this week about the peace talks for Syria, a country that has lost over 130,000 of their own countrywomen and countrymen who earlier this week couldn't even agree on an agenda for their meetings, who at one point were only reading from prepared statements instead of actually talking to each other. If we think anger can't lead to some serious destruction, then we underestimate its power. And it's interesting that anger is so powerful because it's a secondary emotion. It actually happens after we are hurt or we're afraid. Then we get angry. When somebody sees us only as fool and nothing else. And that most conflicts, big and small, almost always happens when we fail to see each other complexly. When we simply view another person or a group of people or a race or a whole gender as one thing, different from us, someone who has hurt us, taken something from us, just not worth knowing, not worth seeing complexly either. So maybe Jesus isn't really blowing this out of proportion, but reminding us that what we say to each other matters here on earth. And it matters deeply to God. And then Jesus seems to take this strange turn into talking about adultery and divorce. So I thought about it, there's a whole lot of anger involved in both those issues. But once again, he says, you have heard it said, do not commit adultery. Divorce is harmful. And as modern readers, we're pretty much on board, again, with the adultery issue. Never a good idea. But divorce nowadays is very different than it was in Jesus' time. I have known people whose lives were saved and dramatically changed for better because they got a divorce. God does not consider any relationship with physical or emotional violence or abuse as to be any kind of faithful. So it's important to take that in context. I think Jesus is directing his argument more specifically at men at this point, who at the time could dismiss a wife pretty easily. His comments on adultery and divorce are tough, but in general are meant to protect the rights of the less powerful in that particular situation, which was the wife. And I think he's addressing the idea again that whenever we devalue any large group, in this case women, that we're being destructive not only to ourselves, but to our community and to the group that we're devaluing. But Jesus goes past this act of adultery, which is important for everyone, but Jesus specifically brings up the way women are viewed. And again, he sounds overly dramatic, plucking out eyes, cutting off hands. But I think it's meant to show how this thinking can infect us. It can poison us in ways we don't even notice. And I would really like to say that this was just a problem in Jesus' time and we don't have to worry about it anymore. But these lustful thoughts still happen, and movie companies and advertisers use it all the time to turn women into objects. That it not only shapes how men view women, but how women view themselves and their own inherent value. And Jesus puts forth this crazy idea in all of the gospel, as one commentator put it, the idea that we should welcome women as sisters of the community rather than avoid them as seductresses. What a good idea. I think that's turned out pretty well. He's also treating men as people of control rather than ones who lose all rational thought around women. I've never understood why men haven't been more offended by this idea. It's a ridiculous excuse for anybody. But both of these issues, adultery and divorce, in his time are again about exploiting or disregarding another person. That whenever you objectify any human being, they become consumable and disposable. And we have control over these issues these days. They did then. We should always have a choice in who we marry and who we love and who we give ourselves to emotionally and physically. We have the choice to respect and to be respected within all our relationships. And in the very next section, Jesus points out one of the easiest ways to show that respect is to tell the truth. And that's pretty much all he says. Just tell the truth. Don't try to hedge it. Just answer yes or no. Don't swear by anything. Just tell the truth. Which again seems pretty black and white, but I started to think about all kinds of stuff with the media and the political systems, and I heard this story on the radio this week about current think tanks that all they do is research and study particular issues that get used most often in our political debates, and they're nonprofits. They're supposed to be nonprofits, which means that they're not influenced by any large corporations or a particular political side or view. But the example in this story, what they found out was that they used the minimum wage. They were talking about the argument over whether we should raise the minimum wage. And amazingly, the think tank that thought that it would ruin the economy and kill business received money from the food industry. And the think tank that came up with the point of view that it would not hurt the economy, it'd be good for the economy, help those in poverty, it wouldn't hurt jobs, received donations from the labor unions. And probably the truth is somewhere in the middle of all that. But something's happened with these kinds of truths when they come out with these studies and we can point to them, that we've taken these truths that they give us, whoever they are, and then we use them to be angry with each other. We use them to create bumper stickers that I can roll my eyes at when I drive past you, to make a whole judgment about who you are as a person from one sentence. These truths allow us to stop listening to one another, allow us to use truth as a weapon against each other. And what I feel like I've seen even more and more is what's become more important than the truth is pointing out that the other person is wrong. I feel like I see that on the news almost every day. That cannot possibly be a part of the kingdom of God. It cannot be who and what we're called to be, right? Jesus didn't die so we could make other people feel bad, right? And here's the amazing part about this passage. These are all actions we can do. We can control our anger. We can tell the truth. We can look upon each other in love. We can value people. And what might the world look like if we did? What kind of world might this kind of behavior lead to if everyone knew they were valued? That they have intrinsic worth just because they are? What if people just didn't say things to harm one another? What if we didn't twist our realities and the truth to be the most convenient or comfortable for ourselves? What if we honored others' bodies and personhood all the time? It might look a lot more like the kingdom. It might look like the world that Jesus found worth saving. I think he says these things because he knows what we're capable of. I don't think he expects us to be perfect. But I think in this passage he's suggesting to those listening to him then and to us now that some days we are just not trying hard enough. But he also believes something much bigger, that by doing these teachings, that as a community of believers, we could have a dramatic effect on the world, an effect we can't even imagine. So I think like the first Valentine, those martyrs for Christ, I think we are invited to let parts of ourselves die for our beliefs. The parts that still see people too simply. The parts that forget to imagine all we meet and all those who are around the world as complex, as inherently valuable creations of God, just like ourselves. May we be willing to try harder, to see ourselves as totally and completely capable of excellence in loving other people. May we celebrate that love is in fact an incredibly tough topic, complex and complicated. But may we accept the challenge and see it and experience it and live it excellently.